Right, so I was going to start out this presentation by asking how many people saw my first presentation. As you probably saw from the MailChimp or whatever communication device you saw, this is Beyond Hello World Part 2. And I was curious how many people saw Part 1, how much of that we need to go over again, how much we need to review, that kind of a thing. But that was going to be more of an interactive, I ask a question, see how many hands get raised, and hard to see the hands at this point. So I will plan on going over just a super brief overview of what we discussed in Part 1. And if anybody has any questions or wants to dive into a little more detail, utilize the Q&A feature and interrupt me. And if not, I will just dive right into Part 2. This is going to be a lot bit more dev focused and code focused than our previous session was. Our previous session had a lot for everybody, but this is really going to be getting deep into the meat of the code of things. And why that's important for non-coders is again, as managers or admins or things like that, having at least a surface level understanding of what your developers are capable of will help you a lot in being able to interface with them. Rather than asking the questions, can you do this, or how hard it is to do this, or whatever, you can help be part of the brainstorming process as far as what the developers are capable of, what you can do with SharePoint Framework, how it generally works, what some of the issues and bugs that might arise. So even if you don't understand all of the nitty-gritty bits of the code that we're getting into, I think even for anybody to have at least a surface level or high level understanding of how this code works and what it's capable of will be good for anybody who's dealing with any SharePoint Framework web parts. So with that said, the obligatory who am I? My name is Josh Cook. I've been a developer for going on 11 years now. I started my professional development with PHP and WordPress, building plugins for that platform, and eventually got a job where they kind of moved me over to .NET and SharePoint, and have kind of a rocky start with it, but ever since they moved to SharePoint Online and this SharePoint framework, I've just fallen in love, and I don't see myself doing anything else for quite some time. I really, really like it, and feel that the capabilities of the SharePoint framework are really strong, and I can do a lot of really great things with it, and I'm happy where I'm at. So as far as my hobbies, I've got my family over here, 2 kids, a beautiful wife. Things that I do in my spare time. This is Magic the Gathering, if anybody doesn't know that. A couple of other board games and card games that I play. Really into Blizzard Entertainment. World of Warcraft has been kind of my latest thing, which has been nice to, during the COVID quarantine, to be able to have a bunch of online games that I can play and still hang out with my social group and stuff like that. It's been kind of nice. Some acknowledgements that we have for the user group leadership, for being able to pivot so quickly in making this online experience happen, and working out all the technical details and the bugs that are associated with it, being able to publicize it so well. Thank you guys so much for making this opportunity happen and available for so many people. Hopefully it's going to go really, really great, and if it does, those are the guys that you can blame for it, is the user group leadership. They've done a phenomenal job in making this adjustment, and hopefully it will just continue to get better and better going forward. I believe our sponsor for this month is Sovereign SP. I'm not entirely sure, I don't know if he's buying pizza and shipping it to all the attendees' houses or whatnot, or how exactly that sponsorship is going to work, but I at least wanted to acknowledge, if nothing else, the willingness. I don't know, maybe if we can talk her on into, we'll do a random raffle at the end for a $10 gift card to the ER of your choice or something like that. So when you get the coronavirus, you can get that. I don't know. I have no idea, but just wanted to at least acknowledge him and his willingness, because he's been a part of this community for a very, very long time. Sovereign SP has been around and has always been a great sponsor of the user group and the things that we're trying to do. So I wanted to give a shout out to him as well. So going to the kind of overview of what we went over last time. This particular presentation, the reason I call it going beyond Hello World, is because there's a lot of really good tutorials out there, including one by Microsoft at this particular link right here. If you just do like SharePoint SPFx getting started or Hello World or something like that in a Google search or a Bing search or something along those lines, you should be able to get there pretty quickly. But they have a great tutorial for how to get started, how to get your development environment set up, how to get the code initially downloaded and started, and how to essentially get Hello World up on the screen, a basic unmodified web part up on the screen. It talks about getting, like I said, getting your dev environment set up, getting the Yeoman generator set up, trusting the development certificate. All of that's really, really well covered in that. But then I never really found a whole lot of good presentations on what to do after that. It's very easy to get to that point, to get started, to get Hello World, but then how do I talk to SharePoint? How do I make changes? How do I make modifications? What do I do with this now that I have a basic framework up and running? And so I thought I would put this presentation together to try and kind of answer that particular question. Again, so this is going to be just really high level overview until we get to the section that we're going to kind of dive deep into. But more of the overview is once you get your Hello World, the way you get it up and running is you type the command gulp serve into your terminal. This will bring up a localhost workbench. The great thing about this is you can do all of your work offline for this particular piece of it. It turns your computer into its own local web server and then serves web pages to yourself. So if you're on an airplane or someplace that doesn't have network connectivity, you don't actually have to have an actual SharePoint page in order to do a lot of this development, because they give you a local mock SharePoint page with the framework that you download. Last time we talked, the project is to kind of do a to-do list of sorts. That's going to be a SharePoint Framework web part. It's going to live inside of SharePoint. And last time we spent the vast majority of the time talking about UI fabric, different styles and different layouts so that you can make it look and feel and lay out however you want. We spent a lot of time talking about the grid, which is similar to the Bootstrap grid, or they call it the Fabric UI grid, or there's one other that utilizes a very similar grid. I can't remember it right now off the top of my head. But it has 12 different sections, and you essentially say, I want this piece of it to take up 3 sections, and this piece of it to take up 2 sections, and this piece to take up 5 sections, and then it scales the page. No matter how wide or how small you are, you've gotten a certain percentage of that page. And it also can adjust dynamically based on width. So you can say if it's below 600 pixels, then this needs to take up more, or this needs to take up less, or this needs to go on top or bottom. And so it makes it really easy to build responsive web parts and themes for your SharePoint environment. Then we talked about how we can put those controls inside of those layouts. So we talked about the text field, the toggle switch, and the date picker. And to kind of show you sort of what those look like right here. So this is our local workbench that we have going on right here. It kind of simulates a SharePoint page. You can see I'm not logged in. There's no settings up here, so it's not an actual SharePoint page. I don't think there's actually a waffle over here either, but at least this middle part kind of tries to simulate what it's going to look like on an actual SharePoint page. So we have our text control right here. We can type whatever we want into something like that. We talked about how to set up the calendar picker or the date picker, so you can go in and select a specific date, and then our toggle switch right here shows that it still needs to be done, or still needs to be done, or is done, I guess would be a great way to do that. We talked about UI fabric icons, and how we can put those on the page and treat them sort of like text. And now we get to, so there was kind of the high level overview of part 1. Pause for just a minute. Does anybody have any questions? Anything they want me to dig into a little bit deeper before we get moving on into state control and how to kind of take this data that we have inside of here and start persisting it a little bit better? Because right now, every time we refresh the page, we just come back to a blank version of the page. Nothing is persisted, nothing is saved, nothing is, we have no record of anything that's being typed inside of here. So it's not great yet, but at least we've got the look and feel down. Nice.
So just a reminder for everyone, we do have your part 1 video up on our YouTube channel. I have posted that in the event Q&A. If anybody wants the link, we can also add it to our Twitter and other places as necessary.
Okay. Comment there from Dave, why is there something and not nothing? I'm confused by that question. All right, well, moving on. So let's see, how do we do this? Okay, so to start talking about state, we have to kind of understand what React is. When we started into our project and started into our code here, when we set up the initial project, it asked us, would you like to use any particular JavaScript framework? And the one that we chose, because that's the one that the vast majority of the Microsoft documentation is in, was React. And so you'll see when we got set up, our initial code right here kind of gives us a React component. React was a framework that was initially written by Facebook developers. The common one that was out at the time was called jQuery. That was sort of the de facto standard that allowed you to do a lot of interacting with kind of the code behind the scenes and what's going on, and the front-facing form or toggles or text or whatever it is that people are typing into. And it allowed kind of one-way communication. If you typed something into the form, you could sort of send it back to the code, but then it was really hard for the code to send it back to the screen and make changes or adjustments that way. People did it because it was kind of the only thing they had available at the time. And then a second library came out called Angular, and its big selling point was that there was two-way communication kind of between the form that was going on and the code that was going behind. And when you made a change to the code, it really easily went to the form. When you made a change to the form, it really easily went to the code. And that made it a lot easier for your developers to save things to databases or to lists and libraries in SharePoint or whatever, because you have this really strong two-way communication between the front end form and the back end code. But it was very slow, especially once you started getting lots and lots of form fields. You could get up to about 100 connections or so between the code and the form before things really started to grind to a halt, and then it just kind of became unusable after that. And so Facebook developers said, well, we can sort of make something that resembles this two-way communication, sort of, but we can make it a whole lot faster. They sort of failed on the first part. What they ended up with, what React is today, is not a very good two-way communication tool in the same way that Vue or Angular is, but what they succeeded on is that it's unbelievably fast. And the way that it gets the speed is that these other libraries have a lot of listeners. That's why having a lot of connections between the front end form and the back end code, it takes, in order to make that happen, there needs to be a lot of listeners. There's essentially a little worker that's running back and forth all the time between the two parts of it, saying, has this changed yet? Has this changed yet? Has this changed yet? Has this changed yet? And he's running back and forth on across all the connections that you have between the two of them. And so they call those listeners. And anytime something changes, he's got to send the message back and forth, and that ends up eating a lot of computing power for your clients. If there's a lot of those connections, a lot of those runners going back and forth. And so the developers of React said, you know, we're not going to deal with that. We're not going to have this runner going back and forth. So instead, we're going to set up something called a state. So you have this object, and in this object is all of your variables, all of your configuration, everything that's needed to draw the page. And then you take that and you pass it to a rendering engine of some kind. And you say, okay, I've got my state here. I've got this object that controls everything. I'm going to pass it to this rendering object, and then the rendering object is just going to draw the page once. And then it draws the page, and everything is set and everything is done. Nothing can move, nothing can change. And then if anything needs to change, what happens is we create a new state object, change one of the variables inside of there, and then redraw the entire page again from top to bottom using that new state object. So for example, when we had our to-do list that we were looking at right here, technically the way React works, this is immutable, this is unchangeable, nothing can happen here. So if I were to go into here and like hit a button or something like that or type into it, technically nothing should happen, except that what just happened in front of your eyes very, very quickly was that there's a variable hiding in the state somewhere that has this value. And we'll call that text value or something like that. So when I typed the G into my keyboard, what it first did is it went into the state variable or the state object, found the variable for this text field, added a G onto it, and then passed that new object back into the render engine, and then it redrew the entire page using this variable now with the G instead of the one without it. Now, at first glance, that actually sounds like a whole lot of work and makes you wonder why they went this direction at all, to redraw the page every single time that you want to change. But as I said, the one thing that they succeeded at when they made React was they made something that was very, very fast. So 99% of the time you can type in here as fast as you want and it redraws the page that many times that quickly, and you'll never even notice that's what's going on in the background. That kind of whole process as far as redrawing the entire page from top to bottom every single time you make a change is invisible to your users because of the way that they designed React. It is very, very fast how it does that. But with that understanding, we can now use that to kind of take control of our SharePoint Framework web part and start utilizing that state for our own purposes. So primarily what we're going to do in sort of step one, I'll get to that in a minute, is we are going to try and make it so that in our state object, in this thing that we're creating and passing to the render engine repeatedly, is going to be all of the information that we eventually want to pass to SharePoint. So every time they, whoops, where'd I go? Every time they make a change to this text field right here, we're going to take that change and store it in a state. And then when they make another change, we're going to take that change and store it in a state. They make another change, we're going to take that and store it in the state. And then eventually, when everything is said and done, when we click this save button right here, all we need to do is take some of that information that we have in our state and throw it up to SharePoint and say, okay, we're done. We saved it to SharePoint. That's great. And then vice versa, the opposite is going to happen when the page first loads. If we want to, we can go to SharePoint, get some of that data out of SharePoint, out of our list and libraries, and we just need to take that information, throw it into a state object, then take that object, pass it to our render function, and this page should come back exactly the way it was when we left it. Just now we have a full, real, persistent data all the way to our database, or in this case, our SharePoint list. So how do we get started creating a state? Well, the first thing is that when we define our React component, it tells it, okay, we've got some properties right here, and this is what is going to be given to us from our parent component. Our parent component, if you recall from last time, is what talks to SharePoint. So SharePoint can give us a whole bunch of information. It can tell us who is logged in. It can tell us what web or what's it called, not in code? Site, there we go. Tell us what site we're on, whether it's a root site, whether it's a sub-site, things like that. We can ask all those questions, whether somebody's authenticated, whether they have permissions to certain groups, things like that. We can ask all of that information to SharePoint from our component, and the way that that gets passed to us is through this property object. So we have this piece right here that talks to SharePoint and then passes us information into our component. And then it asks us, do you want a state object? And right now that's just a blank. So yes, technically we have a state, but we're not doing anything with it. We're not saving anything to it. So we need to go and make some changes to that. So, oh, whoops.
Hey, Josh.
Yes.
We got a question from Paul about how it redraws either the whole page or just the web part or what.
So because React is only in charge of our web part, that's the only part that is owned by our React component, that is the only part that it's going to redraw. And actually, if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty, since you asked, I'm going to nerd out for just a second here. But yeah, we don't have access to the whole page with this particular web part. We only have access to our one little component that we are drawing, that we are in charge of. But the way that React actually does it is it doesn't technically redraw the entire page in your browser. So what it'll do is it has the existing page, the way that it was drawn last time, the way that it was rendered. Then when you make a change to your state object, it re-renders the entire page, but it doesn't actually put it into your browser. Instead, what it does is it then does a diff compare of every line that came out between the two of them, and only where it finds changes between its new kind of pseudo redraw and what's actually on your page will it then take out the existing DOM element and put in a new DOM element. So every time that we redrew that component, the only thing that actually changed in there was what was inside this text box. So it didn't actually redraw anything else on the page. Everything else on the page technically stayed exactly the same, but then it did a kind of pseudo hidden redraw behind the scenes and found this is the same, this is the same, this is the same, this is the same. Oh, this text box is a little bit different. So let me rip out this DOM element, put in this new DOM element that represents the new text box, and then move on with life. This is the same, this is the same, this is the same, this is the same, done. So when I say that it redraws the entire page, that's kind of an oversimplified way of looking at it, because technically it only changes that very small specific piece of something that has changed. So with that in mind, no, it doesn't redraw the entire SharePoint page. I don't have control over that. It only attempts to do a redraw of the component that we are building. And then even with that, it only actually makes changes to anything that is different from the last time that it was rendered. Hope that helps answer the question, Paul. Okay, where were we? So we have our properties. We have our demo one props, and that's what's being given to us from our parent component being passed into us. And then we're going to create a state object. And for right now, inside this state object, we're just going to have a list of items. Because it's a to-do list, it's a pretty simple thing to do. So we have our list of items, and that's really all that we care about at this point. So I'm going to come back here and say, for our state, we're going to use something that looks like this demo state object that we just looked at over here. So now we have a state. Now, if I were to try and save this and rebuild it and put it on the page, it would come up with a problem in that it's now expecting us to take a state object and throw it to our render function, but we haven't actually created a state object yet. It doesn't know what to throw to the render function. So at this exact moment, it would freak out on us if we attempted to do that. So I'm going to use a developer's favorite tool and cheat by copy and pasting. So we're going to add a new function into our component right here, and this is the constructor function. This is fairly ubiquitous across most languages. If anybody's ever written code before, you've probably at least heard of a constructor function. React components are no different. This is when the component first gets created in memory. It's going to run this code in here. So we're going to take our properties. We're going to do anything that our parent wants to do with those properties first. And this is just kind of a magic incantation. It's just something that you have to do, or React doesn't work. You're going to put that in every single component that you ever build. Congratulations, magic, yay. But then once you get past that, we're going to come in here and we're going to say, okay, so first we're going to make an object. That object is going to have items in it. And now that we have an object with items in it, it matches our interface right here, which is an object with items in it. So then we can take that object with items and assign it to the state. So now when this first gets created in memory, we are going to have some kind of state, which means we can then take that state, throw it into our render function, and it won't actually crash our page. For the sake of example, I just created 2 items in here for funsies. So technically we could do something like this. We could just say we have our items, it's an empty list. Ta-da, but at least we have it, we have a state, it's not going to crash our page. That's not going to be super helpful for us moving forward. So again, with the magic of copy paste, going to paste some initial tasks that we have in here just so we can get something to show up on the page. So we're going to have a task 1 that is not finished, and the due date is today. We're going to have a task 2 that is finished, and the due date is today. Just fairly simple, straightforward stuff. Now, right now, you'll notice that, well, you probably didn't notice, but at this particular moment, that state is not represented anywhere inside of our render function. So for example, our text field right here is just a blank empty text field. There is no glue tying this task title to actually show up in this text field. Now, if we wanted to, we could hard code it. So we could say the value inside this text field is going to be whatever is in this state items, the first item, and its title. So now we have a little bit of glue putting those together. So it's going to look into the state's items, whatever the title is. So it's going to say task 1. We're going to take that, throw that into the value here. And we should see when this page finishes refreshing, that we now have a little bit of glue that comes from our constructor and is able to pass information into here. But that leads to another problem, that now we've hard coded that value and we don't have anything to change it. So if I were to type all of those, refresh the page, they all disappear. Also, there's nothing that actually takes what we type in here and passes it back into our state. So again, we still haven't fulfilled the purpose of what we started out, and that's that we want to keep this state object in line with what's on the form so that when we save it, we have the data that we need. So the way that we're going to get the way that we're going to get that is we're going to subscribe to an onChange event. So in our onChange event, we are going to be given an X, and that X is essentially whatever they typed into the box. And then we're going to take that X and we're going to pass it to a function. We'll call it text field changed. And we'll pass that X in, and now we have to go create that function. So we'll come down here, make a private function because we don't want anyone else doing anything with this. Text field change, it's going to take a string, return nothing. And then in here, so this gives us an interesting opportunity to talk about state a little bit more. You'll remember when I said initially that that when the page draws, it's stuck. It doesn't change. We can't do anything with it. We can't change it. So if I were to come in here and just say, hey, I wanted to change the state, this dots. What did I do wrong? Oh, forgot an equal sign. There we go. This dot state dot items sub0 dot title is going to equal X. You think that would be the really nice, straightforward way of doing that. However, that is not actually going to work for us because once the page has been drawn, it needs some sort of trigger or kick or something to tell it, hey, go redraw the page again with this new state. And React gives us a function for that called setState. And then we can pass a state into there. So what I'm actually going to do first is I'm going to create a new variable called temporary state. and I'm just going to copy the state object. And in the temporary state, I'm going to take its item 0 title, set that equal to X, and now I've got the state the way that I like it, so I'm going to tell React, okay, now set the state and redraw yourself using this temporary state that we have made that has been modified as the new state. But like that. Changed. There we go. There's two different listener events. There is onChange and onChanged with a D on the end of it. OnChange is something that happens before the change actually happens, so you can do some sort of validation or verification or something like that. So if there's only supposed to be numbers typed into here or something, I would look at the onChange event, go see what they typed, and if it was not a number, I would just tell it to ignore that. In this particular case, we want what's going to happen after they type something. We're just going to accept whatever they type, and then once it's finished, we have our new value that's in there. And so we want to subscribe to the onChanged event, not the onChange event. Now, if we go back and look at our page here, we shouldn't notice anything different on the front end. It will behave exactly the way that it did before. But now, and it's kind of hard to see this, but now we've got this variable stored in our state. So if we wanted to do something with that variable, we could. One example that I've given before is we could actually mess with what they're typing in. So we could add the number 1 or something to this state variable. So now when they type something in here, we're going to get whatever they typed. We're going to take what they typed, append a 1 to the end of it, store that in our temporary state, and then redraw based on that. So we refresh this, and now every time I hit a single key, I'll type the K key, and you'll see that what I actually got back was K1. I could type the R key, I get R1. I type the T key, I get T1, because I'm actually now fully utilizing the state that we have, the state object, to draw these values. And that's kind of how we get our two-way data binding between what's happening behind the scenes in the code and what's happening on front. So we're actually going to do this with all of our different input fields. Yay, copy paste. So just like we had a text field changed, we have a date picker change, we have a toggle changed. And we're going to leave those. Well, actually, let's go put those in now. So this is our date picker, so we're going to use date picker changed. And well, you don't like onChanged. Why don't you like onChanged? Is date picker something else? It is. Date picker has its own version of this called onSelectDate. Because, you know, why play nice with all the other kids? We're just going to do our own thing. And then for the toggle, we're going to have our toggle changed. And now again, we shouldn't actually see anything different here than what we saw before. Oh, well, that's interesting. Item 0 due date equals date. Did I not put the value in here? Oh, I forgot to put the value in there. So you'll notice that that's actually a great example of kind of what's happening. Because I didn't put any value, it doesn't actually know what to show inside of here. The text field is a little bit smarter and it's able to kind of pretend that it knows what it's supposed to do, but this is technically what it should be doing, is that I can't actually make any changes to this unless I do a state redraw. Interesting. Okay, so we're going to come in here and say the value is going to be the due date, and the value of the toggle is going to be finished. It's not assignable to. Oh, toggle has to be different too. It doesn't have value. It uses checked. Everybody's got to play by their own set of rules. So now all the information that we have in our state is being represented on the page. All the information being represented on the page is being stored in our state. Now you'll notice that in our initial constructor that we put together, I had two different items, but we're only seeing one of them on the page. That's because I've only hard-coded a single text field, a single date picker, and a single toggle, and that's it. Now, if I really wanted to just continue hard-coding things, I could copy this entire row right here, put another one down, and then change all these indices. So instead of item sub 0, I could do item sub 1, text field sub 1, item sub 1, date field sub 1. But anybody who's ever spent any time writing code knows that that is an absolutely stupid way of doing anything. The one thing that computers are really, really good at is doing the same thing over and over and over again very quickly. So if all we wanted is to redraw this piece over and over and over again, let's utilize computers for what they are good for. The way that we're going to do that is inside of our DOM, our HTML code right here, we're going to break into JavaScript code using this kind of bracket notation. So now that we're actually writing JavaScript code inside these brackets, we can say we're going to grab the items that are in our state, and we are going to iterate over them, or as they say in JavaScript, we are going to map them. And in our map, we're going to have an item, and that is going to be, what did I call it? A to-do. And then for each to-do, I'm going to return whatever is inside these brackets. So we're going to grab this nice chunk of code right here, put it inside the brackets, and now we are going to draw one of these rows for every item that we have in our to-do. I think, or do I have to put the word return in there? I have to return it. I'm going to return that. So now when we come back over here, because we have two items in our to-do list, we should see the two items show up on our page right now. So it's drawing this row for the first item, this row for the second item. However, we at this particular moment have a little problem. You'll notice that when we initially set up our items right here, we had a task 1 and a task 2. This one was not finished, this one was, but these both look identical. They both say task 1, they're both not finished. Another funny thing that's going to happen is when I make a change to one of the rows, it's going to make the exact same change in all of the rows. So that's obviously not what we want. Wouldn't be a super great to-do list if everything was required to be exactly the same. So inside of our map, we are also going to get an index number. And now we can do one of two things right here. We can either say, go to this state, get the item that is at our particular index and use its title, or more succinctly, we could just grab the item that we are currently on in our looping structure. So So we're going to grab the item from our looping structure and say, just give me its title. And then when we make a change to that text field, we want to change only the index that we are currently on. And we're going to do this with all of these. So we're going to say, do the item's due date, change the current index, items finished, change the current index. Okay, now I know I just kind of dived right there. I went way under the water for a lot of you people who are not code monkeys out there. So are there any questions, anything that I glossed over too quickly? Anything that didn't make sense about what I was talking about, at least at a high level? I don't expect that everybody watching would be able to go in and recreate this, but at least to kind of have an understanding of what we did and why we did it. Oh. Well, what is happening here? Task 1, task 2. I changed that, it's okay. But you are clobbering task 1. Oh, I forgot to change this to index. For each would be better than map, probably. But for each returns a void. So I can't actually pass the DOM object back from for each. Yeah, see, when I change it to for each, it does actually run that code over each individual item, but it doesn't pass the DOM element back to the render engine to get it to show up on the page. So I've got to go to map so that I can get a JSX element back out of the resulting function. So you're right, it's a little bit slower, but it works. That's an important thing too. Good comment. Okay, so now we have two separate objects. And now that we've got, so this was all to kind of build our engine. This builds our displaying engine that's going to make all of our to-dos show up. So the nice thing about this is now that we have this, we don't have to write a whole lot more code to get more or less to-do items. All we have to do is stuff them into this items table right here, and all of the drawing and all of the rendering and all of the logic about which one is changing and which one is not is kind of taken for us. So if we really wanted to make a whole bunch of to-do items, we could throw something like this into our constructor. And you can see with just a few small changes right there, we've suddenly changed our entire page to have a whole pile of to-do items that are all individually changeable and configurable. They all have their own memory, their own state, however they want. And now that we've got our engine set up, we can essentially scale this to a near infinite number of to-do items that all behave independent of each other. So setting up the engine was a little bit harder than what we possibly could have done, but the payoff is that now all we have to do is manipulate one little object in our memory. we can do anything with the state that we want. So for example, we could create a function called add new to do. And we actually don't even need to pass anything in or back. We're going to create a temporary state. Items, we're just going to push a new thing onto there. Oh, it has to be an actual thing. So let's grab our thing. So we're going to create a new object. So that's what these brackets inside here is. This is going to be a brand new object. It's going to have the following properties: a blank title, not finished, new due date, blank ID. We're going to create that object. We're going to push it onto our items array. And then we're going to set our state. And now we just need something to actually trigger that. So where did we put our save button? Let's just go add another button right next to the save button here. Do you think they have an add button? And then our on click. We're going to get an event, but we really don't care about it. It's going to be this, add a new to do. Oops, I lost the Q&As there. Hey, they do have an add button. Oh, that's really ugly. I would find a different icon in production. But at least this will tell us. So now all we have to do is click this button, and it pushes a new task onto our array because we had the array engine set up to draw this. It just draws it for us, push another one, push another one, push another one, push another one, and we can basically go forever. So now we kind of have this rendering engine set up inside our render function that will draw as many items as we want, and not only draw as many items as we want, but also keep every one of them independent and separate from each other in memory so that we have a bunch of distinct items. And we're doing all of that inside of this state object that we have that we're passing into our render function that we told React about. Constructor, JSX element, on click on change, saving things to state. Awesome, we made it through a slide. Any questions? Anybody drowning? Anybody lost? Googleplex is a number large enough. Okay. So we can't go to infinity. Thanks, Paul, for keeping me on track. We can go to just about any reasonable number of items on a to-do list. How does that feel better? Okay, so our next step is, now that we have all of this information in our memory, in our state object that we have, how do we get it to SharePoint? And looks like we're ending at 1, right, Greg? So I've got about half an hour to go here. Or did we want to? Do we want to end earlier for like our standard Q&A session, or do introductions or anything like that, or is that just going to be weird on a call like this?
I think that'll be hard to do. So you take the time you need, and then we'll just wrap it up.
because I can go for a long time on this.
Wrap it up by 1.
Okay. So we are going to now talk about interacting with SharePoint. So we're going to create a list that is going to store this information. We're going to read that information from SharePoint and write that information to SharePoint. Standard, CRUD stuff. Okay, so we've talked about so far everything that we've done has been on our local workbench. Everything that you've seen, everything that we've done so far has not technically needed the internet at all. We could do this, like I said, on an airplane with the internet shut off, or we could do it on a train as we're moving or whatever. This is all happening on my local computer. I've created a local web server that is serving web pages to this local web browser. I haven't ever needed to leave my own computer to make any of this happen. However, since we are now interacting with SharePoint, that is no longer the case. I'm going to have to actually go to a live SharePoint site in order to set up a list, in order to read from that list, write to that list, so on and so forth. And so Microsoft is kind enough to give people free tenants for developmental purposes only, and you can only have like 5 people on the tenant at any time. But since that's really all we need in order to do this, I went out and got me one. So I am the proud owner of joshcookdevelopment.sharepoint.com. Woo, go me! And we're going to be using that. This is a real, honest to goodness, live SharePoint site out there that should behave just like any other non-government or IRS or all those other people who get special permission to be on older versions of SharePoint. But anybody who's not on an older version of SharePoint, this should behave exactly like it. It's SharePoint Online, just like any other tenant that you're going to be on. For those of you who were here from my first session, I told you that we have our local workbench that is something that kind of mocks a SharePoint page. Well, on every single SharePoint site and subsite and whatever else, you can do this. It doesn't just have to be on the root. Every single SharePoint site out there has an underscore layouts folder. The easiest way usually to see that is if you go to the site contents over here on the side, you can see that you have underscore layouts 15, and then view lists shows us our site contents. If we come over here and go to what's the one I'm looking for? There it is, site settings. You can see that again, we have underscore layouts 15. This is our settings page. So every single site out there has this underscore layouts 15 folder. And we are going to take advantage of a page that's kind of hidden in there, that is the workbench. So we're going to go to Workbench ASPX. Now this page is designed specifically that when you go there, it's going to look at the machine that's running it, at the local machine or whatever, and it's going to try and see, do you have a node server that is serving up SharePoint Framework web parts? And if you do, then this live SharePoint page is going to connect to that node server in order to get its web parts. So if I wanted to add a new web part right here, this should look familiar to anybody who's playing around with SharePoint. You've got your text, your images, all your standard web parts that come with every single page. But you'll also notice now that we have this demo 1 web part. This is being served from my local machine. And you'll notice if I refresh this, takes a little bit longer to refresh because, again, this is an actual SharePoint page, so you'll see all this stuff being lazy loaded in like it does on all the normal SharePoint pages. But this piece in the middle right here, the actual component that I control, the piece that gets redrawn when I use my setState function, Paul, is coming from my local desktop. So this has not been deployed to SharePoint. This web part is not going to show up on any other SharePoint page. It's not even going to show up on any other computer. The only place that this exists is for me because I'm running this local server. You'll also notice a couple of things have changed about it. When I'm working on my local workbench, these things all look blue over here. That's nice and pretty. And again, for those of you who were here for part 1 or saw that, you'll remember that I told these things to change themselves to whatever color the primary color of the existing SharePoint is. Now, I don't know why the primary color doesn't change this bar across the top. I think that's a mistake on Microsoft's part, but so be it. But I've intentionally gone in to my change the look or site change the look isn't there anymore. Anyway, and change the look and change the primary color and the tertiary colors of this particular website to be this disgusting orange color right here, so that you can see that particular difference. This is the same code that's running in both of these places, and yet here all of these things are nice and blue. Here all of these things are this, what do we, rust? I don't know what color that is. This kind of rust color. But again, everything else that we just wrote works exactly the same. We can hit the add to a not infinity number of times, and everything works the same, just now we're on a live actual SharePoint page. So in this live site that we have, you can see more of the primary color, this rust color coming out here. So if we were to take this web part that I'm developing, this to-do, and throw it on this page somewhere, so we could edit this page, hit the add document, put it right here, it would fit in with this same sort of brown rust color that we have going on all across the page. So it fits in very, very nicely with the rest. We're going to go to site contents. We're going to create a list. Now, due to the magic of I'm a developer and I've done this before, ha ha ha, we already have our list. So we've got 3 columns in our list. We have our title column that comes with every single SharePoint list that you get for free. I created a date column that is our due date, and I created a yes/no column that is done. So our goal is to be able to take this information right here, task 321, the due date of 11/16, and this done yes, and bring that down from SharePoint, translate it into what we need in our state, and then throw that to our rendering engine so that it shows up on the page. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to create a function called get data from SharePoint. Oh, read from SharePoint. And yay, copy paste magic. I'll hide some of this so it doesn't overwhelm too many people. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to use the SharePoint JavaScript, or sorry, SharePoint REST API to go get all of the items in a particular list. So the way that we're going to do that is by where did I go? There we go. We're going to go to a very specific website. We're going to go to our root site that we have right here. And then in the same way that every single website, as I showed you before, has an underscore layouts subfolder that has a bunch of different things that you can access inside of it. Every single website every single SharePoint website out there has an underscore API, not a folder, a service endpoint. Has an API service endpoint that you can access. And there are hundreds of things under here that you can get access to. And there is pages upon pages upon pages of mostly outdated Microsoft documentation on how to interact with this underscore API service here. But if you want some more details on exactly how I got to this and what this means, I will leave that for your exploration. But for now, know that we have an underscore API. We're going to go to the current web. We're going to get all of the lists inside of that web. We are going to get a very specific list, namely the one that has the title. So we're going to get by title, demo form list 1. Why did I say 1? Okay, just demo form list. So you'll see this is called demo form list. That's the actual title. And yes, if I were to go in and edit this list, let's see, how do we do that here? List settings. If I were to go in and change the title of this list, it would break my code because we're doing it based off of title. So if I went in and said I wanted it to actually be called demo space form space list and save that, now my code is broken. The web part won't work anymore because I was getting it by title, but I can come in here and just say demo form list, match the title. Now everything works again. So I'm getting it by title, and I am getting all of the items that are inside of that list. Now, if I were to take this URL and punch it directly into a web browser, it looks like somebody threw up on the page. But buried in all of that text throw up that's right there on the page is actually all of the information that I want. It's just not very readable by human eyes, which is okay because we're not going to read it as humans. We're going to read it as computers, and that's very readable by computers. So for example, if I wanted to find this task 321, I could do a Control F, do task 321, and you'll see, aha, there it is. It's even in the title field of something. There's task 321. So all of the information is there. It's just really disgusting to look at. So now that I have this URL that's going to give me the information. Yes, Paul. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you used to have to do the local host and pass a whole bunch of really ugly query parameters into your local host to get it to tie onto the page, but that is not the case any longer. One note for those of you who understand what Paul is talking about there, because we are doing a web part, we don't have to do the ugly query parameters anymore. But if we were to be building an extension, then we do actually have to pass a whole bunch of really ugly query parameters in order to get it to load the specific extension that we want loaded from our local host web server. Namely, you have to tell it that debug mode is true, and then you have to pass the GUID ID of the extension that you want loaded. So if you're developing an extension, then there's some wonky garbage that you have to go through. But as long as we're just doing web parts that just sit on the page like this, then it's a much, much easier experience than it was a year ago. Okay, less tangent. So now that we have our URL, we need to go get information from that URL. Now, SharePoint is kind of a beast when it comes to authentication. So for example, if I were to take this URL and put it into a different web browser, one that I have not authenticated against this SharePoint site with, it's actually going to just come up and say access denied, you do not have permission to get this. SharePoint is very, very good about ruining authentication. If anybody's ever played with SharePoint, you know that you can set up item level permissions, you can set up list level permissions, you can set up site level permissions, you can break all those permissions, break those inheritances, and that all works really, really well even with this API that we're trying to call. So for example, if my particular user who I'm logged into didn't have access to list item 321, if I went in and broke the permissions on this and said I no longer have access to it and I can no longer see it, then I can also no longer see it through an API call. So we're not giving anybody any secret backdoors or anything like that to get at information they shouldn't have. If you can't see it through the front end of the web, you can't see it through the API of the web either. But the flip side of that is in order to keep that level of security, we have to know who is making the API call. Now, in this particular case, because I'm logged in and my credentials are cached inside of a cookie, it went ahead and gave it to us. But inside code, we either would need to figure out a way to do that authentication or to get the cookie and pass it along or to do a new OAuth handshake. And this especially becomes problematic when we're jumping to a different SharePoint site or a different API that is secured through Microsoft OData endpoints, things like that. That authentication story is all very tricky. And if you know anything about OAuth, you understand a little bit of what's going on here. But fortunately for us, starting in version 1.4 of the SharePoint framework, they gave us a nice little tool that makes all of that very, very nice and easy, called the SPHTTP client. So the SharePoint HTTP client. And if we use this, we can call specific functions, either get functions or post functions or whatever, pass in parameters to it, namely client configurations, and it will handle all of the authentication for us, which has just made this, that little change right there that they made in 1.4 is probably the best thing that has ever happened to SharePoint Framework. If you were trying to do this before 1.4 came out, sincere apologies, it sucked. But we don't have to worry about that anymore. So we're going to take our URL, we're going to pass that into an SP HTTP client, tell it that we're using configuration 1. There right now is only one configuration, so you will always pass this parameter exactly like this into your function. And then you're going to get back a response. That response is going to be a SharePoint HTTP client response object. And inside that, you're going to have a function that turns this gobbledygook into a nice JSON object that we can do whatever we want with inside of our code. Now, there's a little red squiggly right here saying that we don't have a context. Backing up just a little bit, you'll remember that I said our entry point into our web part is right here. And this is where we get past all of the information from SharePoint. Who is logged in, what site, what web you're on, that kind of a thing that gets passed in from SharePoint. But right now, that's not actually making it into our component that we are building into our web part. So we have to pass it. The way that information gets to us is through something called a context. If anybody is familiar with doing JavaScript development outside of SharePoint Framework, you'll notice that if you just do regular JavaScript development, there's a SP configuration context object that loads on every single page inside JavaScript that you have access to that gives you a lot of this very similar information. That's essentially what we're grabbing right here. It's pretty much the same object, has all the same information. We're just getting it right now from the parent of this particular component, which at this moment is SharePoint. So SharePoint is passing us a context. We are going to take this context and just pass it down directly into our web part. So now we have to go change our properties. Remember, the properties are the things that are coming from our parent. So we're going to come into the properties and say, hey, now we want a context, and it's going to be a web part context. The definition of what a web part context is comes from Microsoft. And so now we can say this properties, get the context object from the properties, and inside that context object is where we find our SP HTTP client, and inside that client we have our get object. So we've made the call. In production, I would probably do a check right here to say, to make sure that that we got either a 200 or a 204 or 202, no, 400. 200. That we got a good response back saying that it was actually a legitimate call, that we got the data that we were expecting to come back and things like that. And if there was a failed call, if we got a 404 or 500 or any kind of other error message or something like that, I would have some sort of catch function down here that would handle that. But we're not going to go into that kind of detail right now. So we're just going to assume that the call we get back is good, and that inside we are going to have results. Remember, those results are going to come from this JSON response. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to make an array of to-do items. Remember, we told it down here, to-do has an ID, a title, a due date, and a finished. So we're going to make an array of those items. If we want to see what we actually got back from SharePoint, we can look at it in the console's log right here, debugging in case something goes wrong. And then, much like we did before, where we did a map or a for each, actually we're not returning anything here, so for each is probably better. What did I do? There, let's go with that. So we're going to for each over this array of items that we got back from SharePoint. And we're going to look at each list item directly. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to make our blank to-do object again. So we're just going to call it task 1, false, new due date, empty ID. So now we have a blank to-do, and then we're going to replace each one of the fields in that to-do with what we got back from SharePoint. So in our new blank to-do, in its ID field, we're going to look at the list item that we got back from SharePoint and use its ID in there. We're basically going to do the same with all the other fields. So in our new blank to-do object's due date, we're going to use the due date that we got back from SharePoint. In the finished, we're going to use the done. So you'll notice that in our code that we have up here, we're calling this finished. And in our render function, we called it finished. And in our to-do interface, we called it finished. But in SharePoint, it was called done. So we have to do a little bit of a translation to make sure that those can go back and forth. So from our list item, we have the done field, and we're going to put that into our to-do items finished field. So we're doing a little bit of a data access layer translation right here. Most of, the ID seems to line up pretty good. The title seems to line up pretty good. If you really wanted to get super control-y over this, you could actually make all the properties inside of your code line up exactly with the column names that are coming out of SharePoint, and then you wouldn't have to do this translation. You could just say, take this list item, make it conform to our to-do interface, and then push it. But because they're a little bit different here, we have to do this little translation step. Then once we have our to-do item that's no longer our blank to-do item with all this default data, but we have actual data on it, we're going to push it onto this items array that we created right at the very beginning. Then once we've gone through everything that we got back from SharePoint, we're going to now set our state. We're going to set the items value in our state. Right now that's the only thing that's in there, so it's a little redundant, but that's what we're doing. We're going to set the items to the value of this items array that we have been pushing everything onto. Now the one last change that I want to make is, again, I've hard-coded the website right here, but what if we wanted to put this on a sub-site? So what if I made a new one, a new sub-site on my SharePoint tenant called group to-do list or something like that? Then I would have to come back in here and change the code, republish the code, push it back out to SharePoint, and then it would only work on that particular subsite, and anything that was on the root site would no longer work. That seems stupid. Again, because we have information from SharePoint about where we are, we have this properties context, we can ask it and get that piece directly from SharePoint. So let's go to our page context. On that page, we can ask it, what web are you in? And what is the absolute URL of that web? And so now we can take this web part, throw it on any page, on any subsite, on any tenant, actually. And as long as it has a list called demo, oops, got to put those spaces in there, demo form list that has these column names, it should work. Now, for those of you who are very keen of sight, you'll notice that these function names up here are kind of a bright yellow, but this one is kind of a faded out yellow. That is an indication from my IDE that while we have defined this function and it seems to work okay, we're not actually calling it anywhere. So we are going to go ahead and call it. I've only got 10 minutes left. I don't want to get into that right now. Oh, a whole bunch of comments here. Throw up equals J. Yeah, that particular throw up is XML. It's not JSON. It can return JSON, if you pass a specific header parameter, but actually the default API response from SharePoint is XML. Okay, I'm not going to explain this right now. I don't have time to get into lifecycle stuff, and probably most of you either don't care or already understand it. But because of lifecycle stuff, we're not actually going to put this function call into the constructor of this. Because we are using a React component, there are different times that we can tie into when something happens. You can, before a component gets mounted by its parent, after a component gets mounted by its parent, there's different times that we can tie into things. And because we are making changes to the state, because we are calling set state at the end of this function, the proper place to do this is inside of a React function that we get called component will mount. So this is going to happen right before it gets thrown onto the SharePoint page, but after this constructor is run, but only when its parent wants it. If you want a more detailed explanation of all that, contact me later or go read the React documentation. It will explain it to you. Yes, so we're in the component will mount function is when we're going to run read from SharePoint. Inside read from SharePoint, we are setting the items to our state object. That state object is then going to be passed to our render function. Our render function is going to map over all of those items and write them to the screen. So theoretically, if we did everything perfectly, which always happens every time you're writing code, we should be able to go back to our live workbench page, hit refresh, and it should read all three of these list items. Task 400, do the thing with these due dates, 16, 29, 24, 16, 29, 25, yeah, close enough. And all of them are done. Now to make sure that this is actually getting live data, we can make some changes to this. So that one is not, whoa, that was cool. And we'll say do the other thing. So we've just changed our live SharePoint data right here. This one is not done. We added a new word right here. Come back in, refresh. We have do the other thing. This one is not done. We are getting live data from our SharePoint list. Okay, now the last thing I want to go over is how do we send it back? It's actually going to be very, very similar to our read from SharePoint function, except instead of reading from this URL, getting the data, translating it into items, we're just going to do the opposite. So we're going to translate all of our items into a SharePoint list item. Going to make an array of, nope, we're not going to make an array of those. We have to do it one at a time. How did I do it in my demo? Oh, that's what I did. That makes sense. Okay. So through the magic of copy and paste, boom, we have our write to SharePoint function. Now, before I forget, we're going to come up here to our save button. We're going to add an on-click event. About the event, we're just going to call write to SharePoint. We're just going to assume that it's going to write every single thing that we have. Now, this is going to cause a problem in that it will only write items that are there. So if we did eventually add a delete function, we'd have to go. So if we were to like delete, do the other thing, we'd have to go in and handle that differently. But this will, our plan is to just take a single row, translate it into a SharePoint object, go update that exact line item in SharePoint, and then do it again. take this row, take all the data that's in there, go update that exact line item in SharePoint. And then if we get to a row that wasn't there before, then we're going to take this line item and go create a new row in our SharePoint list. And we're going to ignore the delete for right now. So actually, we're just going to do CRUD stuff, not CRUD. So how are we going to do that? First, we're going to go to the same endpoint that we had before. Context page URL, get list by title, demo form list. Nope, that is our read function. Demo form list, items. Okay, so it's the exact same endpoint, except instead of doing a get call like we did before, we got our HTTP client, we did a get call to get information from that. We're going to be using our SHTTP client to do a post call. We're going to be going to the same URL. We're going to be using the same configuration version 1 parameter, but now we have a third parameter as well that is going to be our options that we're going to pass along with this call. What are those options going to look like? Well, let's find out. So we should be familiar with this. We're not returning anything, so for Paul's sake, we'll change this to a for each. So we're going to look at our state. We're going to look at all of the items in the state. We're going to iterate over each one of them. And we're going to have an item. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to determine, are we going to be updating an existing item or are we going to be creating a brand new one? Now you'll remember that every single time I created a brand new item to our to-do list, I put the ID as -1. And I did that up in our constructor as well, the ID of -1. The reason that I did that was so that we could answer this exact question that we have going on right now, is how do I know whether it's a new one or an existing one? The only time that the ID will ever be not a -1 is if we have read it from SharePoint and we have set the ID to whatever ID we got from SharePoint. So interesting, there's no if right there. There should be an if here. Huh. So if our item ID is equal to -1, or sorry, is not equal to -1, then I know we're doing an update. And I need to do some extra stuff to it to make sure that it updates the correct thing. The first is I actually need to change our URL. So if I just go to the items URL, that will give me all items. However, if at the end of this I were to pass an ID, so I were to do items 1 like that, then that tells SharePoint I want to do something to that particular item with an ID of 1. So if we come in here to our site contents, we can change this view. Oh, not format view. Edit view, there we go. And I can show the ID. And so we see these all have unique IDs that are assigned to them by SharePoint. This ID will never change and never get used again. So even if I were to delete this task and make a new one, it would do 4, 5, 6, so on. I would never get another number 1 inside this list. So if I told it I wanted to do something with item 1, it uses that internal ID to know which item I'm talking about. So if the item ID is not -1, so we have an update going on, I'm going to add to our URL this item ID inside parentheses. Then I'm going to tell it that I want to merge whatever data I'm going to send you with the existing data. So that means if there's a column that I don't update, so for example, let's say that I never sent this done field, I only sent due date, title, and ID, then whatever is in the done field before my update will stay there. I don't know of too many instances in my life when I've ever used Oh shoot, I don't even remember what the other option is. There's a merge option, and then I think there's a post option, maybe is what it's called. And the other option is essentially clobber everything that I don't send you. So if I only sent you the title, I want you to blank out every other field. But I don't hardly ever use that. So I say send it the merge, and then this if match is used for optimistic concurrency. If that means something to you, then great. If not, since we only have 1 minute left, I will not go into too much detail, but essentially if match star just means I want you to do the update no matter what. There are some times where you would not actually want to do the update, and if you want more explanation on why that is or where, go Google the term optimistic concurrency, and that should explain it to some degree. Okay, so if we're doing a update, then I need to pass all this extra information, but if we're not doing an update, then we're just fine. So here's what I'm going to do, the reverse translation. So I'm going to create this item that's going to go to the list. It's going to have the column names, again, ID, due date, done, and title. Those are the column names in our list. I'm going to translate that from our item names, which is ID, finished, title, lowercase, due date. So I've created a new object. I've put that object into this thing called options. So I took these headers, if they exist, and I took this item that I've created and put it in here. So I've got a body and the headers, and that is what I add to this post call. So I've got this call with all these options, all these parameters. And you remember when I started this out, I'm going to do this once for each of the items, and I'm going to stuff it into this thing called promises. So I'm not actually making the calls right now, I'm just defining the calls. So this is a call definition, and I'm going to add it to this variable called promises. So for each item that we have, I'm going to make another definition. So I've got 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or however many definitions that I want. And then once I have all these definitions, I'm going to call all of them simultaneously. Rather than calling one, waiting for it to come back, calling one, waiting for it to come back, calling one, waiting for it to call back, I'm just going to throw them all up to SharePoint at the same time. And then when everything is done and everything has come back, then I'm going to pop this up on the screen that says saved all the data. And hopefully this works because I'm out of time. If it doesn't, I don't know that we've got enough time to go through and troubleshoot it. But at the very least, it gives you kind of the concept of what's going on. So here's hoping that it works. A new thing. We're going to change all of these so that none of them are done except the new thing. There's today's date on there. Maybe we can make a few more changes and save. Alert. Save. Cannot read property to uppercase. I'm not calling to uppercase. Interesting. Well, one of those promises broke. It's the fact that I put this headers. All right, we'll give this one more go. Because it might not know what headers is if it doesn't get inside this if condition. Come on, you can do it. Oh, there's the add button. A new thing. Oh, look, it saved some of them. Interesting. None of the to-dos are checked anymore. And this has the DF. So I think it's just having trouble saving my new one. See if that's actually the case. Task 3211111, save. And there it is, 3211111. So we're mostly there. If we refresh it, it goes and gets that information from SharePoint, writes it down. So we created a list to store our information. We read information from that SharePoint list. We wrote to that SharePoint list. Looks like we didn't quite get create either. So instead of cred, we just have r. And that is time. So I didn't quite get to my last slide on how to deploy to SharePoint, but again, that same resource that we talked about at the beginning that talks about how to do a hello world web part, and maybe I'll just put that into the announcements here for all of you. Not on that exact page, but it should get you pretty dang close on how to do a deployment and getting it up to a live SharePoint site and getting everybody else to use it inside the app catalog. And if we really want to go over that at a future date, I'm more than happy to do that as a part 3, I guess, of this particular mini-series that I've gone on to. But that is web parts beginning to end. How to start your development, how to set up the styles, how to put controls on the page, how to work with the state to be able to write to and from SharePoint. I hope that it was informational for all of you. For those of you who are devs out there, I hope you got a lot out of it. For those of you who are not, I hope you got at least enough that you can have a pretty good understanding of what your devs are capable of. And again, I'm always available and open for questions, feedback, responses. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for trying out this new format. I hope it worked out okay.